أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين جميعا ورحمة الله وبركاته. Sisters and brothers, elders, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. أعظم الله أجورنا وأجوركم بمصابنا بأبي عبد الله الحسين عليه السلام. Tonight is a very somber night. We feel the heaviness in the air, and it's come to its climax now from the 10 nights of commemoration. And there's a certain heaviness that fills the heart of the believers. And there's a certain etiquette that has to also be maintained in the lead up to the day of Ashura. I remember when we were kids, so I grew up in Madagascar, a small island, and it actually exists. It's not just a cartoon. And my grandma was very, we weren't necessarily very practicing in terms of, we did what we could. But my grandma, bless her, was very, very strict when it came to Ashura. And, we were young, like 7 or 8 years old, but she made sure to tell us that the day of Ashura, we had to behave as if our own family member, as if our father or mother had passed away. And she would tell us, you don't feel like looking in the mirror. You don't feel like embellishing yourself. You would wear the plainest of black clothes with no embellishments on it. She wouldn't even let us brush our hair. If we were to have breakfast, like obviously, we would try and do the faqa and not eat until after Asr time. But if we were to, we weren't allowed to put milk or sugar in our tea, no butter on our toast or anything like that, just the absolute plainest food. And she'd instilled that in us, that you wake up, or from the night of Ashura, the mood has to be such that you have lost a family member, and more than that even, so for the believers, the atmosphere in our hearts, the feeling in our hearts has to be like that. Now, when you read accounts in the maqatil of, what was the mood in Imam Hussein alayhi salam's camp on, the Tasu'ah and the lead up to Ashura, all the maqatil unanimously talk about this humming sound that came from there. This humming or buzzing sound that came from the tents of Imam Hussein. And they said it was the humming of the believers reciting Quran, of them praying, of them being engaged in salah, because it was the last night that they could engage in worship of their Lord in this dunya. And that's what they spent their time doing. Not because they were scared, not because they were afraid, but because they longed to worship him. So you could hear this buzzing and humming of the Quran in their tents. And of course, if we want to be in sync with them, then and take them as our role models, then it makes sense that that's what we do as well. Yes, we can mourn, latmiyat, all of that, but they chose to worship Allah and recite the Quran more than anything else. And inshallah, we can too. Now, I've been reading this book called In the Words of Imam al-Hussein. It's an amazing, amazing book, from Medina to Karbala, and it basically goes through his speeches every step of the way, every village that they stopped at, and what he was saying. And the point of us studying history at any time is to take lesson, right? It's not just to read stories, it's to take lessons so that we may take the protagonists as role models, or to know how not to be, right? And one of the most striking things that I personally found when I was reading it was how many times Imam Hussein, in the lead up to the day of Ashura, how many times he personally went and addressed Umar ibn Sa'd, personally went and spoke to Shimr, personally kind of sermonized, talked to them, right? It wasn't just they were on that side, he was on this side, and there was no contact. He actually went to them and spoke to them so many times to get them to see the evil of their ways, to get them to see how dangerous their actions were, not for him, but for their own souls. The constant reminder of what are you doing to yourselves was there. For example, just to read you one thing, he says, reflect upon who I am, then look to yourselves and question your thought process. Do you think it's lawful for you to kill me and to violate my sanctity? Am I not the son of your prophet? Am I not the son of Fatima? Am I not the first to embrace what the prophet brought from his Lord? And he continues. And the thing you're left with at the end of all this is, were they deaf? Right? Could they not hear this? Like, why wasn't it going in? Even when you look at later sermons of Sayyidina Zainab, Imam Sajjad alayhi salam, you think, how could people sit and listen to these amazing words and not react? How could they not be moved? How could they not respond? Were they rocks? Were they deaf? And actually, yes, they were spiritually deaf. And this is a very dangerous state of affairs that I'd like to address today, because if it's something that the Muslims of the time could be spiritually deaf, then it's something that can also affect us at some point, right? Where admonitions, sermons, lectures, ayat of the Quran can fall on deaf ears and not have any effect on our souls. And it's something that the Quran speaks a lot about, spiritual deafness. And it's funny because even when you judge the responses to Imam Hussein alayhi salam's words, it's amazing what you read into them. He was using ayat of the Quran that these people had memorized, right? They had memorized ayat of the Quran, and yet it didn't have an effect on them. It didn't strike them when he said it. So when Imam Hussein, just before they go out to battle, he's speaking to Shimr, and Shimr says something like, "In kuntu adri ma taqul," right? Sarcastically, gosh, if only I understood what you were saying. And Habib ibn Madahir turns to him and says, you don't understand what he's saying because you're a beast, you're an animal. You truly can't fathom what Imam Hussein is saying. Shimr was being sarcastic, but Habib was actually, hitting the nail on the head. When Zuhair ibn Qayn goes to address them, right, urging them to support Imam Hussein, don't be misled by this dunya, these are false promises. Shimr's response is to throw an arrow at him. And he says, Amsik anna, faqad abramtana bi kathrati kalamik. He's saying, put a sock in it. You're boring us to death with your speech, right? So their reactions are such that they can't hear, right? And so the Quran mentions many, many ayat about this. It talks about veils on their ears and what happens. So it says, for example, in Surah Anfal, ayat 21 to 22, it says, وَلَا تَكُونُوا كَالَّذِينَ قَالُوا سَمِعْنَا وَهُمْ لَا يَسْمَعُونَ إِنَّ شَرَّ الدَّوَابِّ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ الصُّمُّ الْبُكْمُ الَّذِينَ لَا يَعْقِلُونَ. He says, they say, we've heard all this, but actually they aren't really listening, right? So Allah's standard for what's listening and what's not listening is very different. They say they're listening, but Allah says they're not, right? They're not using their intellect and their ears the way they should. They're not using their hearts to perceive truths. Another one in Surah Al-An'am, ayah 25, he says, وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ يَسْتَمِعُ إِلَيْكَ وَجَعَلْنَا عَلَىٰ قُلُوبِهِمْ أَكِنَّةً أَن يَفْقَهُوهُ وَفِي آذَانِهِمْ وَقْرًا وَإِنْ يَرَوْا كُلَّ آيَةٍ لَا يُؤْمِنُوا بِهَا. There are some of them who open their ears, right? They say they're listening, but we've cast veils on their hearts lest they should understand it. And there's a deafness in their ears, right? Even if they see every sign, they won't believe in it. They're shown all the proofs, they're shown all the signs, they've been told again and again and again until they can't hear anymore. Not physically, but the ears of their hearts. Another one, and it's interesting that they have an aversion to listening to the Quran, right? It irks them. It doesn't give them peace or answers when they listen to the Quran. Another ayah says, وَجَعَلْنَا عَلَىٰ قُلُوبِهِمْ أَكِنَّةً أَن يَفْقَهُوهُ وَفِي آذَانِهِمْ وَقْرًا وَإِذَا ذَكَرْتَ رَبَّكَ فِي الْقُرْآنِ وَحْدَهُ وَلَّوْا عَلَىٰ أَدْبَارِهِمْ نُفُورًا. Right? When you mention Allah, they turn their backs. They can't stand it. Something happens to them. And the ayah before it, interestingly, talks about وَمَنْ يَشْتَرِي لَهْوَ الْحَدِيثِ. So they're happy to pay for entertainment. They're happy to listen to other forms of entertainment. But when the Quran is recited, when Allah is mentioned, it bothers them. They can't stand it. So according to Quranic ayat, They say they hear, they say they're listening, but they're actually not. And hearing and listening are two different things according to Allah, right? What Allah means when He says they're not listening is that there is no change in their behavior. When you think about it, we say the same thing. We say, I gave her advice, but she didn't listen to it. What does that mean? It means she didn't act upon it. She was listening, right? It means she didn't act upon it. So Allah says the same thing. For them to be able to be counted as listening, it means there should have been a change in their behavior. Whatever they've heard goes in one ear and out the other and bypasses their intellect completely. It bypasses their hearts. So in the Quran, not listening equals not thinking, not acting, right? Not using your aql. And it's so interesting that Allah equates the absence of hearing or listening with the absence of the intellect, with absence of the aql, right? The aql is that which makes us human, which takes us towards perfection, with which we connect to Allah. And the verb aqala in Arabic actually means to tie or restrain or hold back, because our aql is that which holds us back from shooting our mouths off, from being foolish, from acting rashly, right? That's, someone who's aqil doesn't do those things. So Allah equates the absence of hearing with the absence of the aql itself. He says, أَفَأَنْتَ تُسْمِعُ الصُّمَّ وَلَوْ كَانُوا لَا يَعْقِلُونَ? Can you make the deaf person hear? And when they can't even reason, they can't use their aql, right? So obviously it's not physical deafness, it's spiritual deafness, but their ability to reason is impaired when they have spiritual deafness. And it's interesting that hearing is such an important faculty that it's the first sense that Allah creates in us. As fetuses, from around 4 months, we begin to hear things. We begin to hear our mother's voice, outside sounds, etc., much, much before sight comes. And some mufassirin have, indicated that, the superiority of hearing to seeing might be one reason why Allah always precedes as-sami' before al-basir, even when mentioning the two names together, right? Another way in that hearing is kind of equated to even physical consciousness is that when you're feeling sleepy in Jum'ah khutbah, if you close your eyes, it doesn't break your wudu. But the minute you stop hearing things, that means you lost consciousness, right? And you have to renew your wudu. So hearing is equated to loss of consciousness. Lack of hearing is loss of consciousness, even physically. So when that apathy or ghafla or heedlessness sets in, Allah, the Quran, calls them deaf, right? He actually categorically calls them deaf. And there's various degrees of spiritual deafness. It's not something that just happens overnight, okay? So it starts off first from distractedness, right? When someone's very distracted by this dunya, they have a love of materialistic things, superficial things, entertainment, shiny objects, all of that, right? Then they start taking Allah's guidance lightly. They feel like they don't need it, right? They feel like they know it all. This is too basic. I know this already. I've heard this already, right? Or they listen to something in order to critique it, in order to react, not in order to absorb. And remember, the guidance from Allah isn't going to come by way of, these whispers in your ear, these magical wahi, right? The guidance comes through your mum, through your dad, through, a lecture, a friend, something we see, something we hear, the Quran, a lecture, even a meme, right? But it's something that we're not receptive to. And we keep ignoring what they're telling us, or we develop a don't care attitude. And apathy sets in, which then brings about arrogance, etc. Ultimately, Allah takes away that blessing. When we don't use our blessings to listen to the truth, to use it in the way He designed it, He says, we cast a veil upon their ears. But the Quran and the Ahadith mention the disease, but they also give us many, many ways in which we can remedy this and in which we can protect ourselves from spiritual deafness. So I want to go into 5 ways to protect ourselves from the disease of spiritual deafness. So firstly is to listen to the Quran as much as we can and to recite it loudly as much as we can, attentively with understanding. Now the reason why When we think back to when the Quran was being revealed, it had such a powerful effect that the Makkans used to physically close their ears so they wouldn't have to listen to it. They'd draw their hoods up over their heads. They would physically kind of not be able to take it, right? Because there was something about it that was miraculous. It was an audible miracle. Some of them would physically close their ears, but then they were still drawn to it, and they would hide behind the Prophet's house at night to still kind of catch a listening, right? And still try to listen to it. So it had this kind of push-pull effect on them, where they wanted to close their ears, and yet they couldn't. They were drawn to it. And you find that other miracles of the prophets, when we're told about Prophet Musa alayhi salam's miracle of parting the sea, or having light in his hands, or Prophet Isa's miracle of bringing life to the dead, curing the blind, we believe in them because we've heard stories about them, right? We've read about it, but we can't see that miracle. We can't experience that miracle again, right? It's just the account that has reached us, right? The Quran is a living miracle which we can experience. It's not just a story of the Makkans who used to experience it. We can experience it on a daily basis if we allow ourselves to, because it was an audible miracle. The impact is on hearing it. Even, the Quran describes how the jinn, the Prophet was reciting the Quran, and the jinn passed by and says, "Inna sami'na Qur'anan ajaba." Right? The jinn were moved when they heard it. So the Quran impacts when it's recited out loud. And because a miracle is there to be experienced, to be tasted. So the first step is in reciting it to ourselves in that way. To recite the Quran loudly, to encourage our children to recite loudly, not just to whisper their 1 page a day or however much they're doing, but to actually experience that. Find a qari that you like listening to and listen to it on a daily basis. It's so beautiful. One of my favorite ayat in the Quran, إنما المؤمنون الذين إذا ذكر الله وجلت قلوبهم وإذا تليت عليهم آياته زادتهم إيمانا. The believers are those who, when Allah is mentioned, their hearts tremble. And when His ayat are recited to them, it just increases them in faith, right? The Quran has that power of removing rust from our hearts. And there's a difference how you recite it, right? Now, this same ayah, if you just chant it in the way you chant it, إِنَّمَا الْمُؤْمِنُونَ الَّذِينَ إِذَا ذُكِرَ اللَّهُ وَجِلَتْ قُلُوبُهُم, it doesn't have the same effect as if you were saying it the way you would recite spoken word poetry, for example, right? If you first read the English or understood it, then said it to yourself in that way, with emphasis, right? Recited it even without a tune, but told yourself off even in certain places, it has a profound effect when you say it like that. There's so many ayat of the Quran that expect us to be moved, right? When you look at all the ayat of the Quran that have wajib sajda or mustahab sajda, why do we do sajda? Is it because it has the word sajda written in it? No, it's because the Quran expects us. The context is such. Allah's talking about His signs in such a way that it should move us to automatically go into sajda. Because Allah says, وَإِذَا قُرِيَ عَلَيْهِمُ الْقُرْآنُ لَا يَسْجُدُونَ. Right? Allah's asking a question, like, why don't they prostrate? So the expectation is that when we're listening to the Quran, it should move something within us that would make us want to fall in prostration, right? Automatically. So, the Quran describes that when it moves us, we should lose control of ourselves, right? تَفِيضُ أَعْيُنُهُم مِّنَ الدُّمُوعِ وَجِلَتْ قُلُوبُهُم. It describes Christians and Jews who are moved to tears when they hear the Quran, right? But so it evokes that kind of reaction, and by repeatedly listening to the Quran and reciting it loudly, it has the effect of keeping the ears of our hearts open. Number 2, to adopt an attitude of listening to learn, listening to absorb, listening to just listen, right? Lots of people, listen in order to respond. Most people, in fact, love to hear the sound of their own voices. So when they're having a conversation, often if someone says, they went somewhere, they did something, it's like, oh yeah, I did as well. Or I bought something, oh yeah, I did, There's always some kind of listening to respond. But in order to be a listener, we first have to be able to appreciate silence, right? We have to be comfortable with silence, just listening, not responding, not always looking out to listen to the sound of our own voices, or always feel the need to fill the void. Sometimes people cannot be comfortable with silence. They need to put something in their ears. They need to be listening to something constantly. They need to be talking constantly. They can't be comfortable just sitting in the same space as somebody else and not saying anything, right? So we have to ask ourselves, are we comfortable with silence first? Are we comfortable giving space to somebody else to just talk, right? And just listen. Imam Ali alayhi salam said, even if you can't be an articulate scholar, at least be an attentive listener. And the Quran in Surah Al-Zumar, ayah 18 says, الَّذِينَ يَسْتَمِعُونَ الْقَوْلَ فَيَتَّبِعُونَ أَحْسَنَ أُولَٰئِكَ الَّذِينَ هَدَاهُمُ اللَّهُ وَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمْ أُولُو الْأَلْبَابِ. So they're listening. How are they going to know what's أحسن القول, right? They follow the best of what is said. They're only going to know what's the best of what needs to be followed if they listen to the whole thing, right? If they listen to be able to learn, and then they're selective about what they take on board. So that was number 2. Number 3, to follow Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's example, because Allah calls himself as-Sami', and he calls himself as-Sami' more than 50 times in the Quran. And it's amazing because Allah's Sam' is very different to ours. He hears every sound that emanates from every creature in every moment, every decibel. He hears our screams, our whispers, our complaints, our thanks, our plotting, our speech, our unspoken thoughts, our intentions. He hears, what's more silent than silence itself. We can't hold multiple conversations at the same time or listen to multiple voices at the same time, right? Mums can, actually. Mums are a different species altogether. They can hear four kids at the same time, but most people can't. You get bewildered or confused, but a Sami' is not bewildered or confused by trillions of voices at the same time, right? He hears and responds to all these voices around the clock. And he says, سَوَاءٌ مِّنْكُمْ مَنْ أَسَرَّ الْقَوْلَ وَمَنْ جَهَرَ بِهِ وَمَنْ هُوَ مُسْتَخْفٍ بِاللَّيْلِ وَسَارِبٌ بِالنَّهَارِ. He says, it's the same to him, whether any of you speak secretly or loudly, whether he lurks in the night or is open in the daytime, right? He says, وَلَقَدْ خَلَقْنَا الْإِنسَانَ وَنَعْلَمُ مَا تُوَسْوِسُ بِهِ نَفْسُهُ. Right? We created man and we know what his own self whispers to him, right? So with Allah, we're constantly live, right? We're never offline with Allah. There's no such thing as offline with Allah. We may make ourselves deaf to his commandments, his reminders, but he hears our every thought. And sometimes, unfortunately, we make him the most insignificant of all those who converse with us, right? Who hear our nonsense. But he gives individual attention to each and every one of us. It's so beautiful that when Prophet Musa and Prophet Harun, he tells them to, go to Fir'aun, who Prophet Musa has been trying to escape from after what he's done, doesn't want to have anything to do with Fir'aun, and now he's told to go back there, right, and rescue the Bani Israel. And they express that they're scared. And of all the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could have said, be patient, be steadfast, be strong, don't be scared. How does Allah reassure them? إِنَّنِي مَعَكُمَا أَسْمَعُ وَأَرَى. I am with you. I'm hearing, I'm listening, and I'm seeing, right? That hearing and listening of Allah is such a comfort to us that he hears everything that we go through. He hears our justifications, he hears our doubts, our everything, right? When we attach ourselves to a Sami', we get a huge source of comfort and reassurance for ourselves. And when we detach ourselves from a Sami', then our soul wanders off trying to fill the void, right? Compensating for that loss in other things. And there's so much comfort to be gained that Allah sees us, Allah hears us. So, where was I? Number 4. So the third one was following Allah's example in being a sami'. The fourth was following the Prophet's example and being an udhun. Right? Udhun in Arabic is an ear. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Tawbah disparages the people around the Prophet because he says, وَمِنْهُمَ الَّذِينَ يُؤْذُونَ النَّبِيِّ وَيَقُولُونَ هُوَ أُذُنٌ. Right? There are people around the Prophet who harass the Prophet, they torment the Prophet and call him an ear. And people used to do that. They used to mock the Prophet and call him an ear, like you're just one big ear, because he used to give people time and attention and listen to their problems again and again for a long period of time. And they didn't like that. The important people, the influencers, didn't like it. Why are you giving time to these small timers? Why are you listening to their nonsense? Why are you listening to the pauper's problems? But Allah tells them off. And he commends the Prophet. He says, قُلْ أُذُنُ خَيْرٍ لَكُمْ. Right? He's an ear of goodness for you. It's the best thing that he's an ear. Why is it the best thing? يُؤْمِنُ بِاللَّهِ. Right? He believes and trusts in Allah. Because he's an udhun, he's receptive to Allah's wahi. Right? وَيُؤْمِنُ لِلْمُؤْمِنِينَ. He's able to reassure the believers and fill them with faith because of his great listening skills. And وَرَحْمَةٌ لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا مِنْكُمْ. He's a mercy and a source of compassion precisely because he's an udhun. So Allah turns it all on its head, right? He turns that yu'udhun an-nabi, right? The fact that yu'udhun, they call him udhun, such a beautiful play on words in Arabic, it's just amazing. But then he turns it into that object of insult, he turns into a praise. That it's not a bad thing that it's an udhun, it's a great thing that he's an udhun. So it teaches us that the Prophet modeled this behavior, that true human connection is based on listening to each other. The majority of communication breakdowns is due to somebody feeling like they're not being listened to, that they're not being heard. When our words fall on deaf ears, you feel someone doesn't understand your pain, right? All it takes is a listening ear, and that's actually the biggest gift we can give to somebody, is hold space for them to talk and we listen. And the Prophet taught us that. And the last one is to be attentive to our acts of worship. It's so interesting how so many of them feature listening, right? When you look at, for example, Hajj, it's amazing that Hajj is actually a conversation. First, Prophet Ibrahim alayhi salam is commanded by Allah to build the Kaaba. He builds the Kaaba and he says, Rabbana taqabbal minna innaka anta sami'ul alim. Accept from us, you are the all-hearing, the all-knowing. And Allah in turn says, وَأَذِّن فِي النَّاسِ بِالْحَجِّ. Announce to the people to come for Hajj. There was no people there at the time, right? He had to just stand on a hill and call out to the void. But then millions and billions of people answer his call and say, Labaik. Right? So there's that constant interchange. And then when we go for Hajj, we're calling Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So hearing features very much in the whole story of Hajj. Right? So constantly there's that urging to call on him, he listens, right? He answers, he responds. Even our salah, the fact that salah is initiated by a call, by adhan, right? It's supposed to jolt us out of consciousness, wake our ears up, our spiritual ears up when we hear the adhan. And that's why it's so recommended to, again, recite the adhan loudly in our houses, because it has a spiritual awakening every time. It's not just a call to prayer that calls us to prayer when it's the time and reminds us, but there's something in the act of calling and opening our ears. And again, it's so interesting. When Imam Sajjad alayhi salam was a captive in Damascus, a man named Ibrahim bin Talha bin Ubaidullah al-Taymi, was from the Qurayshi tribe of Taym. He came to him when he was a captive and he says, "O Ali ibn al-Hussein, who was victorious in this battle now?" Right? So he was taunting Imam Sajjad alayhi salam and saying, "Tell me, who was victorious?" And he, obviously in his sarcasm, he meant to say that the Ahlul Bayt weren't, that they had suffered a crushing defeat and they weren't victorious. And the only thing Imam said to him was, he said, now that the time for prayers is approaching, why don't you recite adhan and iqama? Then you'll know who was victorious, right? The fact that as a Muslim we have to say ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, right? After ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, that it was a testament, constant testament that those who were victorious were Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. So Hajj, dua, salah, even this act of ibadah, this commemoration of Karbala each year is in response to a call that we hear. هل من ناصر ينصرنا هل من مغيث يغيثنا, right? His baby infant child heard the call and responded. Hur bin Yazid al-Riyahi on the other side heard the call and responded. And inshallah we hear the call every year, and with the ears of our hearts wide open, we respond in the way that he expects us to respond, by bringing about a change in our behavior, by waking up from our complacency, by waking up from our slumber. And we pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that moving on from these 10 days, he makes us into attentive listeners, receptive to his guidance, that we're aware of as-sami', listening to us, that we have open ears and hearts to implement lessons from Madrasat al-Hussein beyond Muharram and Safar, that we're conscientious members of our communities, of this ummah, receptive to others, switched on, empathetic, and never apathetic. ربنا إننا سمعنا مناديا ينادي للإيمان أن آمنوا بربكم فآمنا ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.